I'm Ron Paul. I'm a congressman from Texas, serving in my 10th term. I am the champion of the Constitution.
Congressman Ron Paul, you appear to have consistent, principled integrity. Americans don't usually go for that.
We're gonna march on Washington. The people's will shall be done.
The Constitution gives us no authority to police the world or get involved in the internal affairs of other nations. Sure, there are a lot of countries around the world that aren't doing the right things. But if we want to change the world for the positive, what we need to do is change ourselves, set an example, and let them emulate us when we get our house in order. We now have an empire. Some won't admit it, but we do. If you have 700 bases outside our country and around the world, that means we are maintaining an empire. All great empires and great nations end because they extend themselves too far. We have weakened ourselves internally because we are now and not a producer, but we are a consumer. Now we have to borrow. We're the greatest debtor of the world. We owe $2.7 trillion around the world. So that is the reason we have to get our house in order. And the best place to start is, of course, undoing our empire and getting all our troops home.
We have a lot of goodness in this country, and we should promote it, but never through the barrel of a gun. We should do it by setting good standards, motivating people, and have them want to emulate us. But you can't enforce our goodness like the neocons preach with an armed force. It doesn't work. Woodrow Wilson was telling us about that in promoting democracy a long time ago. It doesn't work, and we have to admit it.
You'd pull American troops out of Korea, Germany, Middle East, everywhere.
There'd be several reasons. One, under the Constitution, we don't have the authority to just put troops in foreign countries willy-nilly, and we're not at war. I mean, where does this authority come from? The other major reason is we can't afford it anymore. We're going broke. We're on the verge of doing what all great empires have done in the past: spread themselves too far wide around the world, and then they have to come home because the currency is finally devalued and depreciated to the point where you can't afford it anymore, and that's what the markets are telling us right now today.
I'm suggesting very strongly that we should have a foreign policy of non-intervention, the traditional American foreign policy and a Republican foreign policy. Throughout the 20th century, the Republican Party benefited from a non-interventionist foreign policy. Think of how Eisenhower came in to stop the Korean War. Think of how Nixon was elected to stop the mess in Vietnam. And tragically, we didn't stop it very fast. 30,000 more men died. So when I talk about these long-term stays, I think, how many men are you willing to let die for this? And even on the foreign policy, how did George Bush get elected? Strongly critical of Clinton. Nation building and policing the world. And he changed his tune. And now we are fighting a war, and our foreign operations around the world to maintain our empire is now approaching $1 trillion a year. That's where the money's going, and that's where it has to be cut so we can take care of education and medical cares that are needed here in this country.
The world doesn't need a policeman. We're wise and powerful. Isn't it our responsibility to help others that way?
It's okay for us to have a responsibility personally to help other people. If we didn't have an income tax, you would have more money and you could help as many people as you wanted. But to go around the world and spread democracy and spread our goodness, no. I think it doesn't work. There's too many unintended consequences. And to spread our goodness overseas, it usually requires force. We're spreading our goodness in Iraq.
I have been very attractive and very supportive of what I call a non-interventionist foreign policy. Mind our own business and stay out of the internal affairs of other nations.
You sort of mentioned the concept of foreign entanglements, sort of George Washington's reference when he was departing his presidency. Clearly that's part of the constitutionalist philosophy. Your attitude towards doing business with other countries, China, the Middle East, the Paul administration is leave them be, let them get their own houses in order, and what should the tenor of U.S. relationships be in the international community?
We should permit it. Trade as fast as possible and evenly as possible. I want low tariffs. Tariffs are taxes, and it doesn't tax the wealthy. It taxes the poor person who would like to buy cheap products. We have a foreign policy where we blow up bridges overseas,
And then we tax the people to go over and rebuild the bridges overseas, and our bridges are falling down, and our infrastructure is falling down. So yes, this money should be spent back here at home. We have $1 trillion foreign operation to operate our empire. That's where the money is. You can't keep borrowing from China. You can't keep printing the money. We have to cut some spending. That's what nobody here talks about.
So I'd save hundreds, maybe $500 billion. You could say, have a stronger national defense, have the money to cut some of the deficit down.
You know, the country's in bankruptcy, and when I listen to this argument, I mean, I find it rather silly because they're arguing technicalities of a policy they both agree with. They agreed to going in, they agreed for staying how many years, and these are technicalities. We should be debating foreign policy, whether we should have interventionism or non-interventionism, whether we should be defending this country or whether we should be the policemen of the world, whether we should be, you know, running our empire or not. And you're talking about these technicalities about who said what, when?
I think it's been known for quite a few decades that our foreign policy has what the CIA calls blowback. It has unintended consequences. You can go back to 1953 when we put the Shah into power.
Yes, there was blowback. The reaction to that was the taking of our hostages.
Us supporting Osama bin Laden and radicalizing the Islamics to go after the Soviets, and that comes back as blowback. Our support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and this comes back to haunt us.
And if we ignore that at our own risk. That if we think that we can do what we want around the world and not incite hatred, then we have a problem.
But the big question I remember was, why do they hate us? Remember that? We had about a week where we're all, why do they hate us? And then we just forgot that and went, they're evil. They're evil, we're good.
They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there. I do not believe for a minute that they come here only because we're free and prosperous. That isn't the case. There may be a few, but you can't motivate people to do that. They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. In the Middle East now for 50, 60 years. Right now we're building an embassy in Iraq that's bigger than the Vatican. We're building 14 permanent bases. What would we say here if China was doing this in our country or in the Gulf of Mexico? You know, if somebody did that to us, we'd be pretty annoyed. Or if the Chinese had military bases on our land or said that they came here to protect their oil, the American people would be pretty outraged. Republicans and Democrats would be joining together. You know, we need to look at what we do from the perspective of what would happen if somebody else did it to us. You can't discuss energy without discussing our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is designed to protect our oil interests. The profits, that's not the problem. It's the problem that we succumb to the temptation to protect oil interests by literally going out and fighting wars over oil. And now, tonight, we hear that we're not even willing to remove from the table a preemptive nuclear strike against the country that has done no harm to us directly and is no threat to our national security. I mean, we have to come to our senses about this issue of war and preemption and go back to traditions and our Constitution.
Going into Afghanistan after September 11th.
I voted for that authority to go after those responsible for 9/11. I was very unhappy with what happened because we neglected to pursue Osama bin Laden. We didn't.
But we were justified because he was there.
He was supported by
that country,
and they committed a violent act. But that did not mean that they had the authority to occupy and try to transform Afghanistan, which is a problem that has not gone away yet. It's going to be growing. That is a perpetual problem for us because we did not do what we were supposed to do.
Stand up and listen. A true patriot's mission. This war of attrition now. We'll keep on marching on.
Now, you know, whether you like Republicans or Democrats, does foreign policy change? No.